She slid the contract across the conference table like it was a quarterly report. Emma Lawson, 30 years old, CEO, worth more than most people would earn in 3 lifetimes. Didn't ask. She never asked. She stated, "I need a boyfriend. 1 weekend. Meet my parents. $10,000. The man across from her still had grease under his fingernails. He'd driven 3 hours to deliver a restored classic car and was 90 seconds from walking back to his cracked mirror truck. Jake Carter looked at the 4 bullet-pointed paragraphs that had reduced a human relationship to a legal document and felt the weight of a leaking roof, an empty credit card, and a 7-year-old girl who needed her inhaler refilled by Friday. He picked up the contract. "I'm not sleeping on the sofa." She didn't flinch. Neither did he. And neither of them understood yet that this was the moment everything changed. The barn had been a barn before Jake Carter got his hands on it, and in certain lights, early morning, mid-January, when the wind came in through the gap under the east wall, it still remembered what it used to be. He'd spent 4 years converting it into a working garage at the edge of Claremont, Virginia, 1 repair at a time, and the result was something that looked like a mechanic's shop, the way a well-worn book looks like furniture. Functional, honest, entirely itself. He was good at the work. That had never been the problem. The problem was the roof, which had started leaking in October, and which 3 contractors had quoted at numbers that made Jake sit at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep, staring at the estimate like it might renegotiate itself if he looked long enough. The problem was the credit card he'd been using for Lily's inhaler refills for the past 3 months because the prescription wasn't fully covered, and there was no version of that math that worked out in his favor. The problem was that Jake Carter charged what he thought was fair, and fair, it turned out, was not the same thing as enough. Lily was 7. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a gift for naming things. The truck was Gerald, a 2009 Ford with a cracked passenger mirror and a trunk that only closed properly if you lifted at a specific angle and pressed your hip against the left panel at the same time. She had explained the technique to Jake once with the gravity of someone passing down essential knowledge. He still used it every time. Rachel had been gone 4 years. Lily had been 3 when it happened, young enough that memory worked differently, collecting impressions rather than events. Sometimes Jake thought that was a mercy. Sometimes he thought it was the hardest part. He didn't think about it much during the day. The work helped. The 1968 Pontiac GTO had taken 11 weeks. It was the finest thing Jake had ever restored. A car that had arrived in pieces and left as something close to a portrait of itself, the way it must have looked rolling off the line the year his father was born. He'd driven it 3 hours to Richmond on a Tuesday afternoon, following the GPS directions to the Harrington Building, a glass and steel tower that caught the October sun and threw it back at the street. He delivered the car, signed the transfer paperwork with a man named Davis from the Fleet Coordination Office, and was walking back across the parking structure toward Gerald when he heard his name. Not his first name, his last name. Carter. He turned. Emma Lawson was standing 12 feet away in a charcoal blazer, and the kind of stillness that doesn't come naturally. It gets built, layer by layer, over years of rooms, where showing anything costs you something. Jake hadn't seen her before that moment, but he understood immediately that she had seen him. She'd been watching him deliver the car. She'd already made some kind of decision. "Come with me," she said. It wasn't a question. He followed her to a small conference room on the building's 3rd floor, all glass walls, and a rectangular table that probably cost more than Gerald. She closed the door, set a single document on the table between them, and sat down across from him without any preamble. Jake looked at the document. 4 short paragraphs. Clean, precise language. The kind written by someone who drafted her own contracts because no one else would do it fast enough or right enough. He read it twice. Emma watched him read. "1 weekend," she said when he looked up. My parents have a property at Lake Coventry, 45 minutes from here. I need someone to come with me as my partner, not a colleague, not a friend, a boyfriend. Someone they'll believe." She kept her voice at the same register throughout, the way a person talks when they've rehearsed not how to say something, but how not to feel it while saying it. $10,000. The full amount transferred the Monday after we return. "Why me?" Jake asked. Emma's answer came without hesitation. "Because you don't belong to my world. My parents would recognize anyone from my industry immediately. They've met half of them. A mechanic from Claremont with no agenda and no connections to anyone I know is actually harder to find than it sounds." Jake set the document flat on the table and looked at it without picking it up. He thought about the estimate folded in his glove compartment. He thought about the pharmacy receipt on the kitchen counter. He thought about Lily's inhaler and the specific, grinding arithmetic of a life that was always almost workable. Then he stood up, pushed the chair back, and picked up the contract. "Okay," he said. "But I'm not sleeping on the sofa." Something shifted in Emma's expression. Not quite surprise, but the adjustment a person makes when the situation doesn't behave the way they modeled it. "There are 4 guest rooms," she said. "Good." Jake folded the contract and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He was already calculating what he needed to arrange. Lily's schedule, pickup times, who he could call to cover the 2 days. His mother, probably. She'd do it without asking too many questions if he kept the explanation simple. "I'll need the details before Wednesday," he said. "I have to make arrangements for my daughter." Emma's eyes moved, a small, precise adjustment, the way attention shifts when new information rearranges a mental picture. "You have a daughter?" 7 years old. Her name is Lily. He said it the way he always said it, plainly, without apology or performance. "Is that a problem?" Emma looked at him for a moment that lasted long enough to be honest. "No," she said. "It's not." Jake nodded once, then moved toward the door. Behind him, Emma remained at the conference table with the copy of the contract in front of her and the quiet that follows a decision already made. She'd expected negotiation. She'd prepared for reluctance, or eagerness, or the specific discomfort of a man who needed money but didn't want to say so. She hadn't prepared for someone who simply said yes, stated one condition with complete calm, and then thought immediately of someone other than himself. She picked up her pen and made a note on the legal pad beside her laptop. Details to Carter by Wednesday. 4 guest rooms confirmed. She underlined it. Then, almost without meaning to, she wrote the name beneath it. Lily. She looked at it for a second, then turned the page. The restaurant Emma chose was the kind of place where the menu had no prices on the copy given to guests. Jake estimated each entree at roughly a week of Lily's school lunches and ordered the second cheapest thing without looking like he was doing the math. He was absolutely doing the math. Emma arrived with a folder. Of course she did. She went through it the way she probably ran her Monday morning briefings. Organized, efficient, no time wasted on preamble. Her parents, Martin Lawson, 65, former corporate attorney turned family patriarch, a man who had dominated boardrooms for 3 decades and now redirected that energy into chess, fishing, and strong opinions about property maintenance. Carol Lawson, warm in the way that functioned simultaneously as hospitality and interrogation. She made people feel welcomed and examined at the same time, often within the same sentence. "The cover story is 3 months," Emma said, turning a page. "Long enough to be meaningful. Not so long they'll wonder why they haven't heard about you." "How do we explain meeting?" "The car." Emma looked up. "You delivered the GTO to our building. I came down to sign off on the transfer personally. I always do with the collector pieces. We talked. You asked if I wanted to get coffee." Jake turned that over. "Did I?" "In the story, yes." "And did you say yes immediately? Or did I have to ask twice?" Emma's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but the thing that happens just before one. Once. I don't do things twice. Jake took a drink of water. That tracks. He pulled a napkin from the dispenser and uncapped the pen he'd brought from the truck, a habit from years of writing down part numbers and repair notes on whatever surface was available. Emma watched him write across it. Martin, chess, fishing, Douglas connection. Carol, traditional cooking angle, first meeting story, Harrington delivery. He underlined the last one. Emma looked at the napkin for a moment. You're taking this seriously. You're paying me $10,000, Jake said. I take everything seriously that gets paid $10,000. He glanced at his watch, a quick, involuntary movement. Emma caught it. She didn't say anything immediately, which was its own kind of question. I pick Lily up at 6, Jake said. Not defensive, just true. There's no one else who does it. Emma signaled for the check without being asked twice about anything. In the parking lot afterward, in the particular quiet of a city evening when the traffic has thinned, but the lights are still full, she asked him Lily's name again. She'd heard it in the conference room 3 days ago. She already knew it. But she asked as though she needed to hear it one more time, the way you read a name on a map before you travel somewhere you've never been. Lake Coventry in October looked the way certain memories look in retrospect, sharper than they had any right to be, every edge defined by cold air and still water. The Lawson property was large without being ostentatious, a house built to last rather than impress, surrounded by oaks that had been old when the house was new. Martin Lawson shook Jake's hand the way men of his generation shook hands when they were paying attention. Firm, direct, holding the grip long enough to learn something. Jake held it back without trying too hard. Martin's eyes did a quick inventory, the calluses, the posture, the absence of performance. And whatever conclusion he reached, he kept to himself and poured 2 glasses of bourbon instead. Carol hugged Emma first, then turned to Jake with the particular warmth of a woman who had decided to like you before you arrived and was now simply confirming her own judgment. She asked about the drive, about the car he restored, about whether he wanted coffee or something cold. She asked all of this in the span of 90 seconds while steering them toward the kitchen, and Jake understood immediately that in this house, the kitchen was where everything real happened. The weekend moved at a different pace than Jake had expected. He'd prepared for performance. What happened instead was something closer to recognition. The water pump broke Saturday evening, 20 minutes after dinner. Martin discovered it and announced it with the particular frustration of a man accustomed to things working. Jake asked to look at it, found the cracked coupling near the basement pipe within 4 minutes, and fixed it with a spare fitting he kept in Gerald's toolbox, a habit Rachel had teased him about relentlessly, carrying a mechanic's kit everywhere, like the world might need repairing at any moment. It turned out the world often did. Martin watched the whole repair without speaking. When the pump came back on, he handed Jake a dish towel for his hands and said, "Emma didn't mention you were useful." "She didn't know," Jake said. Martin considered this. Chess? They played 2 games after the table was cleared. Jake lost the first in 20 moves. Not because he threw it, but because Martin was genuinely good, and Jake hadn't played seriously since college. He lost the second in 38 moves. Martin won both and poured more bourbon anyway. It was, Jake sensed, his version of a compliment. At 8:30, Jake's phone buzzed. He stepped into the hallway and sat at the bottom of the staircase, answering on the second ring. Lily's voice came through immediately, already mid-thought. Gerald made a weird noise today when Grandma started him, and she said, "It was fine, but it did not sound fine to me." "What kind of weird noise?" "Like a cough, but tired." "That's just Gerald warming up in the cold. He does that." "I told Grandma that," Lily said, satisfied. She didn't believe me. They talked for 10 minutes about the nature documentary Lily had watched with his mother after dinner, about whether cuttlefish were actually smarter than dogs. Lily believed they were. Jake had no strong position. About Gerald's various noises and what each of them meant. He talked to his daughter the way he always talked to her, like she was a person worth talking to. Carol passed through the hallway twice. The second time, she stopped. "Is that your daughter?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the phone. "Yes, ma'am." Carol stood for a moment with the particular expression of someone filing something away in a private drawer. "Tell her good night from us," she said, and continued down the hall. The house was quiet by 11. Emma found Jake on the back porch at midnight, a glass of water in his hand, watching the lake. She came out with a blanket over her shoulders and sat in the chair beside him without announcing herself, because the kind of quiet that had settled over the property wasn't the kind you broke with pleasantries. The water caught pieces of the moon and broke them apart. Neither of them spoke for a while, and neither of them seemed to mind. "You're good at this," Emma said eventually. "The chess, the pump, my mother." She turned to look at him. "My father." "I was just being myself," Jake said. "That's exactly what I mean." He looked at her. In the dark, with the formality of her professional register stripped away by the hour and the cold, she looked like someone he might have known in a different life, or was just beginning to know in this one. What Emma said next, she had never said out loud to anyone. Not to the accident investigators, not to her parents, not to the therapist she'd seen for 8 months after, and then stopped seeing when she got good enough at managing to make the appointments feel redundant. She said it the way people say things late at night, when they're tired of carrying the weight alone, and the darkness makes it feel almost possible. His name was Nicholas. They had been engaged for 14 months. 7 years ago, on an ordinary Tuesday, Emma had sent him a text changing the location of their dinner, a different restaurant, closer to her office. She'd had a late meeting. He was reading that text when the light changed. The other driver never saw him coming. She had told herself in the years since that she couldn't know for certain, that he might have looked up, that there were other variables. The investigators hadn't asked, and she hadn't volunteered it, and the story had calcified into something manageable, an accident, a tragedy, the loss that explained the particular shape of everything that came after. "I've never told anyone that," Emma said. The lake held its stillness. Jake was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone searching for the right response, but the silence of someone who understood that some things need to be heard before they can be answered. "What was his name?" he asked. "Nicholas. You've been carrying that a long time. 7 years, give or take." He nodded once, slowly. Then he told her about Rachel, not the facts of it, not the timeline, but a Tuesday morning 6 weeks before the end, when Rachel had insisted on making pancakes from scratch. The first batch burned. She laughed at it. And Jake had known, in the way that the body knows things before the mind agrees to know them, that he was looking at the last ordinary morning. Lily had been 3, young enough that memory gathered impressions instead of events. "She doesn't remember much," Jake said. "I don't know if that's better or worse. I've stopped trying to decide." They stayed out there for another hour. The conversation moved through territories that usually take years to reach, and they reached them tonight because of the dark and the water and the specific honesty of 2 people who were too tired to perform. When they finally stood and walked to the edge of the porch, the gravel path leading back toward the lit windows of the house, Emma kissed him. No audience, no contract, nothing that had been planned or negotiated or prepared for. "That wasn't in the agreement," Emma said. "No," Jake agreed. "We should probably be careful." Probably. They walked inside through a silence that had become something entirely different from the one they'd walked out into. Emma transferred exactly $10,000 on Monday morning. Jake thanked her by text. She replied that he'd been very professional. He wrote back that she had been too, and then neither of them sent anything for 3 days, because the contract had ended, and neither of them knew what the rules were now. It was a Friday. Emma, deep in acquisition due diligence for a deal she'd been building toward for 18 months, when an unfamiliar number with a Claremont area code appeared on her phone. An older woman's voice, slightly breathless, introducing herself as Diane Carter. "Jake told me not to call," Diane said. "But I thought you'd want to know. Lily was just admitted to Claremont Memorial." Emma was out of her office before the sentence finished. She drove 3 hours without stopping, the same route Jake had driven to deliver the GTO in reverse, at a speed she would not have been able to legally defend. She found the pediatric wing by following the signs, and then by following the particular instinct of someone who had decided, somewhere on Route 60, that she was going to be there regardless of whether she had any logical claim to the situation. Jake was in the waiting area. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands laced together, still in his work clothes, a streak of grease on his left forearm. His eyes were on the floor. When he looked up and saw her walk through the doors, something moved across his face. A brief, involuntary relief, the kind a person shows when they've been holding something alone and suddenly don't have to anymore. He hadn't expected her. He hadn't called her. But when she appeared in that doorway, his expression told her everything about whether he was glad she'd come. Lily was stable. Bronchospasm. Caught early. Responding well to the nebulizer. Jake brought her out 20 minutes later, small and pale in a hospital blanket, holding her stuffed rabbit with the grip of someone maintaining dignity through difficult circumstances. Lily looked at Emma with the direct, unguarded assessment of a child who has not yet learned to approach strangers sideways. "Dad said you came," she said. "I did. Dad said you drove really far. 3 hours. Lily considered this. Dad doesn't like driving far. He says the highway is bad for your mental state. Then she leaned her head against Emma's shoulder and closed her eyes, with the complete confidence of someone who had decided, in approximately 45 seconds, that this was a perfectly reasonable place to rest. Jake looked at his daughter, leaning against Emma Lawson in a hospital waiting room, this woman who had handed him a contract 3 weeks ago across a conference table, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the carefully managed grief he'd carried for 4 years. Not the deliberate emptiness he'd built around it. Something quieter than both. Like a door he hadn't known was closed, left slightly open. 2 weeks later, Emma was reviewing an acquisition file when the anonymous message arrived through the company's external communication portal. Clean, short, and precise, in the way that threatening things often are when the person sending them has done this before. Withdraw from the Praxis acquisition. You won't like what comes next if you don't. The message contained an internal project code that existed in exactly 11 confidential documents. Someone inside the company had fed information to whoever sent this. Emma forwarded it to her head of security and said nothing to Jake. 4 days later, a second message arrived. This time, Jake found out. He was direct about it, the way he was direct about everything. "You need to go to the police," he said. "Someone with access to your internal documents is threatening you. That's not a business problem to manage. That's a crime." "I know," Emma said. "Then act like it." She did. She filed the report. But Emma Lawson had also spent a week doing the calculus that her brain ran automatically on every problem, and she had already identified what she believed was the source. Victor Aldrich, a senior shareholder in Praxis Technologies, who stood to lose significant ground if the acquisition closed. She arranged a meeting at a building on Faro Street, a tower mid-renovation, 3rd floor stripped to concrete and exposed pipe, the kind of place a man like Aldrich would choose specifically because it suggested he didn't care about comfort or consequence. She did not tell Jake she was going. She told herself it was because she didn't want him to worry. She knew that wasn't the whole truth. The conversation with Aldrich escalated faster than she'd anticipated. He moved around the table toward her. Emma stepped back, caught her heel on a construction pallet left in the wrong position, and went down hard. Grabbing the table edge slowed her momentum but couldn't stop it, and her head caught the low concrete step at the base of the interior staircase. Paul Reeves, her security detail stationed in the hall, was through the door in 3 seconds. Emma didn't lose consciousness, but the room tilted and refused to straighten. An ambulance was called. Jake's phone rang at 4:47 in the afternoon. He was underneath a vehicle when Paul called, and he was already sliding out before Paul finished the sentence that contained the words, Ms. Lawson and hospital and conscious. He wiped his hands on his shirt, walked to Gerald, and drove. He didn't think about what that meant, the not thinking, the just driving. He thought about it later. But in that moment, his body had already made the decision before his mind had finished the question. The neurological monitoring room was small and very white, and Emma Lawson was sitting up in the bed with a bandage above her left temple and the particular alertness of someone running on adrenaline who has decided not to acknowledge that fact. Jake came through the door, and she spoke before he could. "I'm fine." "Not yet," he said. "But you will be." He sat down in the chair beside the bed, the same way he'd sat in the hospital waiting room the night Lily was admitted, without ceremony, without needing to announce that he was staying. He didn't reach for her hand or say anything designed to comfort. He was simply there, which was the thing Emma had spent 7 years making sure she didn't need from anyone, and had apparently needed anyway. "I should have told you," she said. "You didn't want me to stop you." "You might have." Jake looked at her steadily. "That's why." Emma looked at the ceiling. The bandage pulled slightly when she turned her head, a useful reminder that the body keeps its own records, regardless of what the mind decides to manage. She had gone to that building alone because she was accustomed to solving her own problems, and because, somewhere beneath the efficiency and the forward motion, she still believed that letting someone in meant giving them the power to slow her down. "Next time, tell me anyway," Jake said. "There won't be a next time." She said it quietly, as though deciding it in the act of speaking rather than reporting a decision already made. "Not the going alone part. Not the not telling you part. I won't do that again." Jake stayed through the night. He slept in the chair with his jacket folded under his head. And when Emma woke at 3 in the morning and looked across the room, he was still there. His breathing slow and even, his work-worn hands resting on his knees. She lay in the dark and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that this was what she had been afraid of for 7 years. Not loss. Not the specific grief of Nicholas. But this, the particular vulnerability of having someone present in your life who would drive without thinking the moment something happened to you. Someone whose absence would leave a shape. She had spent 7 years making sure nothing could leave a shape. She looked at Jake in the chair, and she stopped being afraid of it. Victor Aldrich was arrested on Thursday. The Financial Crimes Unit moved quickly once Paul Reeves gave his statement, corroborated by a contractor who had been working on the 2nd floor of the Faro Street building when the incident occurred. The source inside Emma's company turned out to be a junior analyst, a young man under significant personal financial pressure who had passed documents through a secondary channel he believed was untraceable. It wasn't. The Praxis Technologies acquisition closed 6 weeks later at $230 million. Emma was in the conference room when the final signatures came through, and she thought, briefly and without meaning to, about a napkin in a restaurant where the menus had no prices, and a man who had taken notes with a pen from his truck because he took seriously everything worth taking seriously. She sent him one text. It closed. His response came 4 minutes later. Told you it would." She read it twice, then set her phone face down on the table and finished the meeting. Jake and Lily appeared at Emma's apartment on a Wednesday evening, 1 week after she was discharged. Lily was carrying a pot with both hands and the focused expression of someone transporting something important. Jake was carrying nothing, which meant he had spent the drive managing the logistics of a 7-year-old and a full pot of soup simultaneously. "I supervised the whole thing," Lily announced, setting the pot on Emma's kitchen counter with great care. "Dad did the cutting, but I did the seasoning. The seasoning is the important part." "It absolutely is," Emma agreed. Lily had also brought a book, selected from the library on the basis of its cover, which featured a woman in a structured blazer standing in front of a city skyline. She presented it to Emma with the confidence of someone who had made an objectively correct choice. Emma examined the cover. "She doesn't look like me." "Her hair does," Lily said, with the absolute certainty of a child who has studied the matter. Jake, standing in the kitchen doorway watching this exchange, felt the corners of his mouth pull in the way they did when something was genuinely funny rather than politely funny. They stayed for dinner. They stayed for 3 hours after dinner. Lily moved through Emma's apartment with the natural ease of someone who has decided a place is comfortable and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Examining the bookshelf, asking about a framed photograph on the hall table, settling eventually on the living room sofa under a blanket that was cream-colored and soft, and that Emma had stopped thinking of as hers and started thinking of as the one she kept for when Lily visited, which was a thought she hadn't examined too closely. At 9:30, Lily was asleep on the sofa, still holding her stuffed rabbit, the blanket pulled up to her chin. Jake lifted her carefully, the practiced, effortless movement of a man who has carried a sleeping child enough times that his body knows the angle and the weight, and carried her down to the truck. Emma stood at the apartment door. He came back up for the pot, and she was still standing there, in the kitchen now, looking at the refrigerator. "She left something on your fridge," Jake said. Emma turned. Held in place by a small silver magnet was a drawing. Crayon on the back of a paper bag, slightly wrinkled from having traveled in a 7-year-old's backpack. 3 figures of varying heights in front of a square house. Underneath, in the deliberate, imperfect letters of a child just learning to make words, stay where she put them. Jake. Lily. Emma. Emma stood very still. "She does this," Jake said. He leaned against the counter, his voice carrying the particular gentleness of someone handling something carefully. "She draws families, started after Rachel. For a long time it was just the 2 of us. Then she added, Gerald." Emma didn't look away from the refrigerator. "You're the first person she's drawn since Gerald," Jake said. Emma reached out and touched the edge of the drawing lightly. Just her fingertip, just the corner. The way you touch something you don't want to disturb. "Jake." Her voice was steady. She turned to look at him. "I want this." He was quiet for a moment that held the specific weight of someone who has learned not to say things he doesn't mean and not to withhold things he does. "I know," he said. "I want it too." Spring came to Lake Coventry the way Martin Lawson had predicted it would in February, with the specificity of a man who had been fishing the same water for 30 years. The striped bass appeared in the 2nd week of April, moving in from the deeper channels, reliable as a calendar. Martin and Jake were out on the wooden boat by 7 in the morning. They fished for 6 hours. They caught 4 bass, released 3, kept 1, because Carol had requested it in the particular voice that Martin Lawson, for all his courtroom authority, had never found a way to refuse. The conversation on the water was not constant. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of 2 people who have established, without formal negotiation, that they understand each other well enough to share silence. On the dock, Lily sat with a small fishing rod that Jake had found second-hand at a sporting goods sale and restored himself. New grip, cleaned reel, line tested for strength. Carol sat beside her in a folding chair, teaching her with the patience of a woman who had raised 2 children and understood that expertise requires repetition, and that repetition requires patience, and that patience is its own kind of skill. Lily asked a question approximately every 15 seconds. Carol answered each one. Emma stood on the bank and watched all of it, her father at the stern of the boat, more relaxed than she'd seen him in years. Her mother bent toward Lily with that particular focused attention Carol gave to things she'd decided mattered. Jake, near the bow, moving with the ease of someone who had found where he fit and stopped wondering about it. She recognized the feeling slowly, the way you recognize something you've known before, but haven't encountered in a long time. She was home. Not because of the property, or the lake, or the house she'd grown up in. Because of the people. These specific people. The ones she would choose, and who chose her. In whatever configuration this was that none of them had planned, and all of them had arrived at anyway. The evening light was copper over the water by the time Martin went inside to read, and Carol took Lily to the kitchen for a project involving the relative merits of brown sugar versus white. Emma found Jake at the end of the dock, sitting with his feet hanging above the surface, looking out at the lake. She sat down beside him. "The first time we were here, I spent the whole weekend watching the clock," Emma said. Jake kept his eyes on the water. "I know. You were counting down. Back to your apartment. Back to the version of your life you understood." He looked at her then. "And now?" Emma reached into her jacket pocket. She had been holding what was inside since that morning, had stood in her kitchen for a long time before deciding to bring it. It was a key. Small, ordinary, attached to a wooden keychain that Lily had painted herself in pale yellow, with uneven flowers along the edges. A gift from the week before, presented with the clear assumption that the key already existed and that Emma would know exactly what to do with it. Lily, it turned out, had understood certain things before anyone else had said them out loud. "I know this isn't a ring," Emma said, "and I know we're not there yet, but I want—" She stopped. She was not a person who stumbled over words. Jake waited, giving her the same quality of quiet he'd given her on the porch at midnight, months ago, when she'd told him about Nicholas. "I want you to be able to walk in. I don't want you to have to knock anymore." Jake took the key from her hand. He looked at it for a moment. The pale yellow paint, the small, imperfect flowers, the complete sincerity of a child's understanding of what it means to belong somewhere. "Lily painted this," he said. "She wanted to." He closed his hand around it. From inside the house, the kitchen window threw warm light across the dock, and through it came the sound of Carol's voice, explaining something with great authority, and Lily's voice interrupting with a question, and then Lily again, louder, directed outward through the glass into the evening air. "Emma, Grandma Carol says you have to come in because we need to know if you like soft cookies or crispy ones, because it changes everything." Jake turned toward the house, then back to Emma. She was smiling, not the composed, controlled expression she had offered him across the conference table the afternoon this began, but the real one, the one that still sometimes surprised her when it arrived, the one that had surprised him the first time he saw it, into understanding that something was happening he hadn't planned for. "Soft?" she called toward the window. "Always soft." Lily's response carried clearly across the evening. "I knew it." Jake stood and held out his hand. Emma took it. They walked up the dock together toward the lit kitchen window, toward Carol's voice explaining the chemistry of sugar ratios with the confidence of someone who has made this argument before and won, toward the warm and specific sound of an evening that didn't need to be managed or performed or presented to anyone. The lake went still behind them, silver in the last of the light. And the family, the one that hadn't known it was becoming one, not in any conference room, not in any contract, not in any arrangement negotiated across a polished table on an afternoon that had seemed, at the time, entirely ordinary, finally came to rest exactly where it belonged.